One of our main themes today, of course, is we're reflecting on the first year anniversary of the COVID-19 outbreaks. This day, a year ago, 5th of March 2020, the first person tested positive for COVID-19. It was a 38-year-old man who'd been on holiday in Italy with a group of 10 people, and he tested positive, his wife as well. And then the pandemic pretty much blew up since then. But it's had its effect not just on people, but on business as well. And to give us a sense of what that business story and that business journey has been, we're now joined via Zoom by Jason Hamilton, who's a lecturer at the University of Stellenbosch Business School. Jason, thanks very much indeed for joining us. Welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
So this time a year ago, we were hearing that it's a question of when rather than if the pandemic coming to South Africa. But I guess business had no idea what effect it would have for us and how long it would start.
I think that's a very fair comment, and I must say I almost want to say it's only been a year since we started dealing with this, because it does feel like much longer. And obviously, it's now very clear that this is going to stay with us, and we're going to be dealing with we're actually still dealing with the pandemic, but we're going to definitely be dealing with the fallout from the pandemic for years to come. So I think from a business perspective, if we reflect on 2020, I think it's almost, you can use the word businesses has been decimated. And I think it's fair to use that type of word, because some have survived, but many have not. And we've seen this on the personal front as well, with many individuals obviously losing their jobs, and at least in the short term, no sense of when that will actually be able to recover. So I think if we then talk about businesses that have gotten through 2020, emerging into 2021, well, what does that actually mean? And I don't think it's necessarily, I think it's a duality that's actually forming, in that there is some positive signs from a global and local economy point of view, that economy is starting, or the global and local economy is starting to recover, but we're still facing a very sensitive economy and a very volatile economy, I think, at least in the short to medium term. And this means that businesses will need to be very careful in their planning, which is something which obviously they dealt with in 2020, but I think this mindset will still have to carry forward for a good few years. And if we look at, and we saw last week also in the budget speech, that a recovery, if we talk about a recovery, it's not something short or medium term. It's definitely a long-term view we have to take. So for us to look forward then and say, well, by when will we recover? Well, the view is 4 to 5 years we'll be in a position where we were in 2019 from an economic point of view. And obviously then, if you draw that down into business, whether you're talking about SME or large companies, that has a detrimental impact, or at least the long-term view that needs to be taken has an impact on what short-term and medium planning can then take place, because you're clawing back from a much reduced base. But it again means that although you can have this focus on the longer term, there's still going to be some short-term knocks. Again, being said that with vaccines being rolled out, confidence is building or rebuilding globally and locally, and at least that momentum should help us to carry us forward over the sort of medium term. I think also if we start looking at how firms reacted to the pandemic, we saw some companies reacting very strongly, meaning they pivoted. So I think we heard the word pivot quite often. And this simply means that they've adapted and changed their strategy to meet industry customer and market needs. And I think, again, this attitude or that ability to be able to change your strategy, probably in a very short term, is a trait that will serve companies well going forward. And again, as I mentioned, this is something applicable to one-man enterprises, SMEs, and I think even your large listed entities. I think a further concern, though, is many firms, if they have survived, have emerged with much higher debt levels than before and also depleted resources. And unfortunately, if we're going to rebuild, we need investment. And where's the two sources you can raise funding from? Well, it's debt, lending, or then equity. And I think this is again something which, if companies are growing, they will
Yeah.
have to access further debt, but they're already going to have very leveraged balance sheets, which again makes this recovery path, at least over the next 2 to 3 or 4 years, very precarious. And I think it's a risk factor that definitely needs to be considered and managed very, very carefully. I think on the equity side also, I think if you talk SMEs, probably many owners would have used personal wealth to bolster the balance sheets of companies, but that's also finite. And again, this is where the investment community locally and internationally then needs to actually step in. So I think on that front also, as the global economy is recovering, foreign direct investment is something crucial for us to be able to rebuild.
All right. I mean, one word that kept coming up was disruption, and I think you talked a little bit about it in terms of changing strategy. But I would dare say that there are things now that we're going to do that we were never doing before. I'd never used Zoom, for example, before COVID-19. And now the idea of working at home is not as far into the future as it was before COVID-19.
Yeah, I think we've definitely been, and this is for everybody, I think everybody's been thrusted a few years into the future, and by this. Again, I haven't necessarily seen, and I think a few people have commented on this as well, that all the trends that have emerged during and because of the pandemic and us dealing with the financial and the health crisis related to it is probably not new. It's always been there and has been adapted at some level, somewhere within either private or personal lives or then within organizations. But it's definitely been brought to the fore. I think for me, staying on that or that sort of theme, I think one thing that has come forward quite strongly is, I think, business re-looking at itself and the focus moving away from efficiency so much, but to sustainability and robustness, rather than focusing on efficiency so much. And I think this you can then equate to supply chain management, etc. I think then if you want to bring sort of the more people side into it, I know ESG has always been a big focus for companies and for governments as well, but very much focused, or at least when it's spoken about, very much focused on climate change. However, if you're looking at ESG in total, the S, which is society or social side of it, the people side of it, has now become much more important. And I think the good thing for me is that in the pandemic, we've seen most companies and definitely all the governments globally react in a humanitarian way. So reacting and realizing that citizens are important, our people are important. So I think that's something also that's emerged strongly through this, and it's going to stay with us for a long while, and rightly so.
E-commerce, the other thing as well. I've never bought as much online as I've done in the past year. And to be honest with you, I'm not sure that I'm going to get into my car and keep driving to the mall anymore.
Well, every piece of technology that I'm using right now, I also bought via e-commerce in the pandemic, because I realized that face-to-face meetings isn't going to happen. We can't go out. We need to connect locally and globally. So I agree. Even someone like me, and you, as you mentioned as well, I think a lot of people have been forced, but I think also. I think I think there's a few of those trends that's going to stay with us, and I think people have adopted. I think obviously on the other end of that, again, e-commerce requires connectivity. So I think again, there's this disparity that's also highlighted, and again, not just in our economy, it's in a few economies, which is also important then to be aware of. And then about, if this is where the world is going, who are we including and who are we excluding by our actions? That being said, if we look at what some trends, at least from if has come forward from a sector point of view, staying with sort of tech being one of the ones that has come to the fore and actually I think flourished in this. We've seen retail do very well. We've seen agriculture do very well, agri-processing around that. Healthcare and pharmaceutical is obviously on the radar. And then, as you mentioned, technology. But I think linked to technology is also education, because I think the ed tech side of things have also accelerated, which is a very relevant discussion point or area for South Africa and then Africa to also be focusing on, with connectivity becoming so much more, but then education being such a cornerstone to lift people out of poverty in the long term. So I think around these sort of trends and industries that have thrived, there's a lot of opportunity around that, whether it's analog or digital. I think those are the industries that are going to drive a recovery, and the opportunities around those industries is linked to their value and supply chains. So I think there's opportunity almost for anybody and everybody around those sectors, whether you're involved with it currently directly or not.
All right, and perhaps as we start to wrap up, 4IR again accelerated somewhat, which means, and we've seen it, some jobs are disappearing faster than ever before. New ones will be created, but the skilling perhaps not at the same pace.
That's very true, and I think this is again where if we talk about this social or society side of ESG that becomes so important in around, if we talk about inclusive growth, if we talk about building back better, well, who are we building back better for, and who are we going to take along for the ride? And I think this is where, from a South African point of view, we have to take an Africa view as well. And I think with initiatives like the African Continental Free Trade Area that came into effect now, I think initiatives like that, we trade with ourselves, trade with other African nations, is going to be a huge driving force. I think elements like that makes even traditional industries still very, very lucrative and gives a lot of runway to still create jobs and accelerate jobs. But again, it can't be done in isolation. I think it's going to take a lot from a continent point of view for us to work together, but then also locally for companies and industries to collaborate a lot more. That being said, as I mentioned already, I think, again, as we know, education is a key part of that, because if the more we educate, the more upskilled people become, which opens up a lot of opportunities, whether it's locally or whether it's on the continent.
All right. We're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much indeed for joining us. And as a lecturer of business, I am sure that this period of time has created so much more literature for you and your students to review. Thanks so much for joining us, Jason Hamilton.
It's a pleasure. Thank you very much.
All right, that's Jason Hamilton, who's a lecturer at the University of Stellenbosch Business School, talking to us about what COVID-19 has meant for business, and certainly has been a disruptor and a destroyer at the same time.